Good afternoon. My name is David Dyke, the Director of the Economic Research Council, and I'm really pleased to introduce you to our second event of the Econ Club series this year. We're really delighted to be joined by the economist and author Paul Ormerod, and he'll be here today talking to us about behavioural economics and rational choice theory. As usual, the themes discussed today will link well with the concepts that you've learned within your studies and can be seen as a means of stretching your understanding. The talk will be recorded, and this will be made available to you later to go over again, or if anybody else has missed the session. We'll have a Q&A session towards the end of the talk. If you do have any questions, please do feel free to type them in the Q&A section, and we'll revisit these at the end. Okay, without any further ado, I'll hand over to Paul. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, David. Yes, I think behavioural economics is really quite fashionable, and some people regard it as being representing quite a serious challenge to the core model of rational choice in economics. And I think there's some examples that I'll come on to the end, which certainly do raise questions about that, but that's something that I'll come on to at the end. But I think, first of all, some background on behavioural economics is really quite important.
Oh, sorry, Paul. Oh yeah.
I'm trying to move my slides down. Okay, background. This is now showing background.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good. Okay, so talking about the background of behavioural economics, I think an important point to realise is that in terms of the development of economic theory, it's really relatively new. That if we only go 30 years, seems a long time, but it's not very long in the history of economic theory. But just 30 years ago, say in the early 1990s, most economists have never heard of behavioural economics. It just wasn't in their consciousness. And insofar as they had, they thought it was some sort of weird, far out pursuit, that it wasn't really part of economics properly. And that's like a generation ago. So people who were taught as undergraduates in the early 1990s would never have come across it at all, and even in the 2000s. But in the intervening 30 years, there's really been massive changes in people's awareness of behavioural economics. And so some of the leading academic journals in the world will now routinely publish papers which purport to be behavioural. And there have been two important recognitions within the economics profession of the importance, because Daniel Kahneman, who really pioneered behavioural economics in the 1970s and 1980s, received the Nobel Prize, it's actually as early as 2002, for his work and this is in the citation, applying psychological insights to economics, particularly in the areas of judgment and decision-making under uncertainty. And Richard Thaler, who was inspired by Thaler's University, and he took a great risk as a graduate student in the 70s by studying behavioural economics. But he was eventually rewarded because in 2017 he also got the Nobel Prize for simply his contributions to behavioural economics. It illustrates how the area has become really very respectable within economics. And there is his 2016 book, Misbehaving. I don't know whether any of you have looked at that, but if you're interested in behavioural economics, I think it's very valuable. It's very accessible. It's very well written, and it's really a story about the development of behavioural economics, because he was in his, really right at the start, but way back in the 1970s when he was a young graduate student. So that's the background. But does it represent a challenge to the standard model of decision-making in economics over rational choice? So Let's just remind ourselves, I mean, just very quickly, about the assumptions which underlie rational choice theory. So the assumptions, quite simply, are that each agent has a fixed set of tastes and preferences. Obviously, they operate under a budget constraint. And so in any given situation, the agent's able to gather information on the attributes of the alternatives which are available, which are being considered. And so with this information, subject to a budget constraint, and comparing them to the agent's tastes and preferences, the agent's able to make the optimal choice. And this theory, or certainly the proposition that, if you like, when the set of incentives, when the attributes of the alternatives, one of which will be the price, it could also be the quality, could be a range of things, but we, as economists, we normally think of the price, but it could be a wide range of factors. When these change, people often make different decisions. So we can see there's a huge amount of empirical support in favour of this. Certainly, if you deal with people outside of economics, who often might express a certain amount of scepticism about this. But an example which I like to use is to say, well, although I'm always certain, I always say, yeah, I'm sure that nobody. I mean, this is what we say with academics who are not economists. Say, well, I'm sure they never break the speed limit, but if for some reason they were driving along and they were going faster than the speed limit, when they see a speed camera coming up, they'll slow down because the incentives have changed. You know, if you're driving at say 80 on a motorway, which people often do, the chances of being stopped by the police for speeding are, virtually zero. But the chances of being caught by a camera, if you go past it, are quite high. So the incentives have changed. The likelihood of getting a penalty for speeding have changed, so people slow down. They alter their behaviour. So to what extent does behavioural economics challenge this decision? But first of all, so what is behavioural economics? And it's important to realise, I think, that there are two really quite distinct strands. One of which is analytical and descriptive, and the other is normative and prescriptive. It draws out potential implications for policy. The other is stepping back and saying, does it help us understand this particular situation better? And the second strand is to say, well, can we use these insights to develop better policies, to be prescriptive, so we can achieve a better outcome? But I think there are a couple of points here. Certainly, most of it, leaving aside the prescriptive side of it, it is essentially driven by empirics. It's not theoretical. It's one of the drivers of making economics much more empirical over the past 20 or 30 years. And so if you go again, going back 30 years, I mean, those of you who go on to study economics at university will be looking at these articles in the top economics journals. And 30 years ago, most of them were purely theoretical. Not completely true, but that was the majority. And now it's switched. Most of them, even if they're about theory, have to have empirical evidence. And this is one of the drivers that's doing it. But it is important to understand that it's empirical in the sense that it takes the rational agent model as the normal behavior or as the idealized behavior. And then it's looking for deviations from this in a particular context, this reference point. And Tyler makes this very clear in the book that I mentioned. It's saying, okay, we've got a way in which economic theory says people ought to behave, and can we observe situations in which they don't, in which they're not taking the decisions which rational choice theory would indicate would be required. And so it's looking for these particular deviations. And certainly from a policy point of view, if people observe deviations from rational behaviour, a lot of the policy prescriptions which are put forward are essentially based on altering agent behaviour, trying to nudge it in the phrase which they use, to encourage them to take so-called rational decisions. And I think this slide is really the key thing to understand about behavioural economics. Certainly, say 10 years ago, many people thought it was a fundamental critique, but increasingly it's being absorbed within the mainstream, and it's saying, well, can we look for anomalies? Can we look for differences? Now, when we're looking for this, it raises some interesting questions about what does constitute evidence in this context. And a lot of studies might say do a particular survey or take a single example and say, in this context, people are not behaving rationally. But evidence like that is really quite weak. What we're really looking for are situations in which there are many examples of a particular phenomenon. It's not just a one-off study that people have done or a one-off survey. Though there are many examples on different scales and different ranges where we observe the same phenomenon of deviation. Now, as imperfect information and asymmetric information seems to me to be, if you like, a precursor, an important precursor of behavioural economics. Because this, again, although it's now just an absolutely fundamental part of economic theory, and so the assumption that we made earlier about the idealized model in which people have perfect information. Now, in general, economists assume that in most situations it isn't true, and either all agents have imperfect information, or it's asymmetric in that some agents have got better information than others when making decisions. And again, although this is older than behavioural economics, but in terms of the history of economic thought, this is still relatively new. It wasn't really introduced into economics until really the early 1970s, principally by George Akerlof and by Joseph Stiglitz, and they got the Nobel Prize for this work in 2001. So instead of assuming that people have complete and perfect information about choices, they have imperfect or asymmetric information. So there's a deviation from the standard model, which has now been incorporated into economics, and the theory of how people behave under these circumstances. Economic theory has been expanded to take this into account. And I'm going to give some examples in a minute or so about areas where there is behavioural economics has shown quite a number of systematic deviations from standard rational choice theory, and which theory needs to respond in the same way that it did to the challenge set up by Akerlof and Stiglitz in terms of imperfect information. But a question to always ask is whether a particular finding in behavioural economics can already be explained by rational choice theory just as well. And Tyler gives an example in his book of something he claims to be evidence of deviation from rational choice, but I don't think it is. And this is using the concept of firm behaviour. When we say firms maximise profits, even textbooks of 50 or 60 years ago would say, well, there can be a difference between behaviour which maximises short-term profits and behaviour which maximises long-term ones. And the example which Tyler gives in his book to illustrate this is the Super Bowl in America, the final game of the season in American football. which is, I think, the most popular program on the whole of American television. Tens and tens of millions of people watch it. And so Tyler points out that the stadium, wherever it's held, clearly for this event could be filled many, many times over. And so the prices which could be charged for seats would be astronomical. But the organisers of the competition choose not to do this and set prices which are not much different from those which will be charged at a normal game. And Tyler says, well, what they're doing here is appealing to the concept, if you like, of fairness. It's not fair that regular fans who could afford the price of an ordinary ticket should be excluded by suddenly having the price, instead of being, let's say, $100, suddenly being 10,000. So it would exclude people. That's the sense of fairness. But we might think of it differently. We might say, well, actually, what this is showing is that they could make more money in the short term by charging, let's say, $10,000 for a seat rather than $100. But in the longer term, this might erode the brand, make it less popular, and it could pose problems for the long run sustainability. So we might think of these things in terms of the difference between long and short term profit maximization. And there's a similar examples from football in the UK. Occasionally, I think it was 3 or 4 years ago. I think it was just before the pandemic, in fact. I think Liverpool had a proposal to increase the price of their season tickets. They had some new new owners, and they wanted to have a massive increase in the price of season tickets. And the fans protested. Said, well, was that fairness? And the owners gave in eventually, or was it really considering whether to try and maximise short-term profits or to have regard for the longer term? So that's an important thing to think about whenever an example comes up and people say, well, this is an example of a deviation from rational behaviour. Can it, in fact, if we think about it, can it be explained within the context of the rational choice model? But I suppose a really fundamental question is whether agents can learn to avoid deviations from rationality. So we might observe in a particular circumstance agents behaving differently from what rational choice would indicate. But if they're confronted with this in a repeated way, do they learn to avoid deviations? Now, I suppose a slightly irreverent example of this is also given by Tyler in his book. And it's one of the things which brought behavioural economics into the public consciousness. This must be 10 or 15 years ago, maybe 15. Was and this is about lavatories. So let's be clear. So in men's lavatories, they can get the urinals. They do get sometimes pretty disgusting. And in Amsterdam Airport, they introduced they said, okay, that they will paint on the enamel a fly on each wall. And again, Tyler mentioned this book. And so that actually did a lot to solve the problem, because people saw the fly, or they knew it was a painting, but people couldn't resist, if you like, aiming at the fly. And that worked for a period, but then the impact faded away and it lost its impact. So if like people learn not to do that, that's a rather irreverent example that I think is quoted by Tyler in his book. So then people, didn't really bother with that for a period. So this is a question, I think, do people learn? We might have some evidence, but if it's in a repeated context, will people converge more on a rational agent model? But let me give some examples of areas where I do think there is substantial evidence that which behavioural economics has thrown up, which standard rational choice doesn't incorporate, and to talk about how mainstream economics has tried to incorporate. I suppose the first one is the one which Kahneman himself popularized and did a lot of work on in the 1970s, so-called prospect theory. So when we're thinking about how people react to potential gains or expected or actual gains and losses. A standard assumption made for a long time in economic theory was that people treat them the same, that if you like, they treat them symmetrically. But prospect theory offers a lot of evidence in a lot of contexts that this is not true, that people dislike losses much more than they like a similar gain. And I think this is a very, very well established result. This goes back, say, to some papers that Kahneman did in the 1970s even. So a lot of evidence has accumulated in lots of different contexts that this is the case. But I can get all into economic theory instead of making the choice that in the utility function people treat losses and gains symmetrically, we can treat them asymmetrically. A slightly more complex one is how do people discount the future when you're thinking about an action which will yield costs and benefits in a stream over the future, then obviously something which might happen in 10 years is worth less than something now. So we have to think, how do we discount it? How do we reduce the value to put it on a present day value process? And since the start of economic theory, economists assumed that this was done in a particular way, that it was discounted in an exponential way using a standard exponential function. And this meant the future, £100 10 years now, not what's the same as £100 now, but it declined at a steady rate. That's what it essentially means. And I think by and large, this was adopted by economists because it's much more mathematically tractable. It seemed a reasonable assumption to make, and it's much easier to do the maths around this than if you use anything else. But again, there's a guy called David Leibson at Chicago who wrote an important paper in the late 1990s, suggesting that this may well not be true. And in fact, in many situations, people attach much more weight to the present and the immediate future than they do to some distance away in the future. So rather than it declining smoothly, it is here and it declines precipitously as we move into the future. And I think this is a very important empirical finding because it might be one of the reasons for understanding problems in getting people to accept, for example, measures on climate change. That we know that climate change is a problem, and it's going to be a bigger problem in the future if we believe the scientific models, which of course there seems to be a huge amount of evidence that they're well based. It's going to be a bigger problem in the future. And so the question is, governments want people to take action. Now they want to incur costs now to mitigate the problems of climate change, to derive benefits in the future. But if people follow what Leibson calls something called hyperbolic distance, where you're attaching much more weight to the current and the immediate future than to more distant future, then it's not clear that this might explain why many policies like this are extremely unpopular, because people are attaching a weight to the benefits in the future are valued much less than the cost which they're incurring now. So it's not merely an abstract concept. It's got a lot of empirical evidence, but I think we might be able to think about, understand why climate change policies are not getting the acceptance which we feel they ought to have because of this. I think a couple of other things, one of which is economists have a concept, obviously, of some costs, that once you've incurred some costs, they should not influence your behaviour now if you've incurred costs in the past, because they're in the past. There's nothing you can do to alter them, and we should therefore not take into account of them. Now, although it's many years since I played the game myself, but I still take an interest in it. In the Times every week, in the puzzle section, there's a very interesting column on the game of poker. And it's very interesting. It's not just about poker. It's got some, some quite good insights into human behaviour. In a sense, it seems that the top poker players are very rational. They do take account. So if they put the money in the pot, thinking they're going to win, and then something happens, a card is drawn or whatever, or the opponent bets in a particular way, and they think, well, they're probably now not going to win. The point is, the fact that they've already put a lot of money in shouldn't count. They should ignore that and take a decision on the evidence available at the time. But it turns out there's a lot of evidence in many contexts. People do seem to pay more attention to this than economic theory suggests. There's also what are known as endowment effects, in that people attach more value to an object which they already own to one which they could acquire by buying. I mean, it's rather paradoxical. There's a rather trivial example, but very nice, given by Tower in his book about copyrights. That's not trivial, but there's lots of examples of people attaching more value to things they own than to very similar or even identical ones that they don't. But I think it's the final one. And I think, in my view, this is a technical phrase which I think either Kahneman or I think Tower might have introduced it. I think Kahneman introduced it. The so-called architecture of choice. And I think it's this one which I think poses the biggest challenge for standard economic theory. It's harder to explain why. It simply means if you're making a decision, let's say the classic one would be if you're in work and there's a trade union which is recognised. Say in the civil service here, there's lots of public sector, lots of trade unions. Do you have to? And if the union is working closely with the employer, which they should do in most situations, the employer could either say, no, you must tell me that you want me to deduct your trade union dues before I pay your salary, so you can opt in. Or the employer says, well, we'll assume automatically that you want to join the union, and you have to opt out. You have to tell me you don't want to be in. Now, these are relatively, if you think the fees are relatively small, the membership dues are relatively small, but the way in which the question is framed, whether it's opt-in or opt-out, seems to make a massive difference to the outcome. If it's opt-out, most people join the union. If it's opt-in, most people don't. And there's another example with, for a long time, governments have been trying to encourage people to save more for their pensions. And in recent years, the British government brought in a scheme where you're part of your employer's scheme and a certain amount is deducted. And you have to opt out. And that's boosted very considerably. They're not large amounts of money involved, but it's better than nothing. It's boosted very considerably the number of people participating in pension schemes. But when we think about the size and the amounts of money involved and the huge difference in the two outcomes, it's very difficult to rationalize this by standard economic theory. And I think this is really one of the outstanding challenges which have been posed by behavioural economics to mainstream theory. The other ones, in various ways, in the same way that imperfect information was absorbed into the theoretic model, these other ones can be. I think this one's much harder. But just finally, on the policy side, initially, some fantastic things were claimed. Gentala, with a guy Cass Sunstein, published a book in 2008 called Nudge, which was that's when behavioural economics was becoming quite famous. people could be nudged using these ideas into different types of behaviour. And there was an interview. The book sold extremely well, and Amazon did an interview published on their site. And they were asked to say, well, what areas of policy can behavioural economics make a difference in? And they said to name just a few, and emphasise that just a few, right, makes a difference. They said they could get better investments for everyone, more savings for retirement. I'll give an example where that did work. Less obesity, well, that's obviously not worked. More charitable giving, a better planet, an improved education system. We can easily make people both wealthier and healthier by devising friendlier choice environments or architectures. And I think the only fair thing to say about that is that the enthusiasts themselves have backed away from such extravagant claims. And certainly in his 2016 book, Misbehaving, or might be 2015, Thaler really backs away, spends quite a lot of time backing away from this and saying, well, look, yes, we have a new armory of tools. We may be able to influence behaviour in ways not completely indicated by rational choice theory, but we're not playing in these things anymore. It's much more modest. And just on that point, and just to finish, I did notice this announcement this month, because when David Cameron was Prime Minister, about 10 years ago, maybe, he set up to great fanfare in Downing Street the Nudge Unit, a unit incorporated, driven by behavioural economics to influence government policy. But it turns out this is now being closed down because the individual government departments who've been receiving this advice or getting advice essentially for free were asked to say, well, will you now pay for its upkeep? Will you make a contribution to keep the nudge unit in place? And it turns out they didn't think it was worth it. They didn't actually say, well, now we've got to pay for it. No, thanks very much. So that's been closed down. It doesn't mean that behavioural economics is wrong. There's nothing to offer. But I think these things which they did claim massively, 10, 15 years ago, through experience, they've backed away from. And I do think it just indicates in a way what I've been trying to say, or sort of my final message is to say, behavioural economics has been a valuable empirical tool. It extends, the way we think about things, gathers more evidence, and where it does seem to indicate problems for rational choice theory, it can in general incorporate these into the model relatively straightforwardly. Though I say that the one thing which really puzzles me and puzzles everybody else is this architecture of choice question, why it actually makes such a massive difference when the costs and benefits are relatively trivial. But I'll finish there. I'll be quite happy then to take any questions.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Paul. I really appreciate you taking the time to explain all of that. I've certainly learned a lot. Great stuff. Thank you. I'll open it up to questions from the audience in that case. Feel free to just type in any questions that you might have into the Q&A section, and I will take those. But in the meantime, I did have a few of my own from the things that you've discussed there, I guess. Starting with the slide that you've got up there. Why do you think the kind of narrative has shifted so much in the last 15 years? Why does that statement there seem quite comical? Yeah, in terms of the kind of, I don't know, the enthusiasm that they've had for it back then 15 years ago. Why is that being scaled back so much?
Well, one of the very important points to make is that, economics at the micro level, has always tried to change behaviour. One of the key things is going back decades now, governments thought, of all parties thought, smoking is too high, and so tobacco taxes have risen. Now, there are other reasons, but that's a key reason why smoking's fallen away. It's become very expensive, so you can price it that just through the price mechanism. So these things can work. I think one of the reasons is that in practice, they found it, that the results were not terribly what you actually do So it's all very well to say, well, how do you nudge people to be less obese? Now, it doesn't mean it's a very difficult problem, but we can see certainly the last 15 years, the population's got quite a lot fatter. So they've not really worked. It's actually harder. It's one thing to say, yeah, we've got these brilliant new insights, which revolutionise economics, and so you're enthusiastic about it, and then you try and do it, and like in some areas, like more savings for retirement, that did work in the UK. It's had an impact. Not because the amount of money is there, not massive, but it's made a difference. But I think just trying to put it into practice, you can see, well, it doesn't make that much choice. And I think one of the reasons might be again that people can learn. Initially you might say, okay, that alters my behaviour, and then you adapt to it and you forget about it. So I think it's had less. It's actually had much less impact than they thought. I mean, look at this list here. I mean, both of them, they're both very clever, very successful people. But you say that to name just a few, you might as well say we can make the entire universe better. I'm surprised they didn't put in end wars as well. But they backed away from it because they were clearly too extravagant in the first place. And they're more modest. And I think it's more realistic a result and perhaps a bit more powerful.
Okay, great, thank you. And I guess looking at the other side of the coin, what you mentioned the case of the Dutch toilets, and you mentioned the idea of auto enrollment as well, that I'm sure a lot of people will have come across. What areas have seen quite a lot of success in this then?
Well, obviously I think the pensions, but also I think we can reinterpret a number of policy successes in the light of that. You might have thought of that at the time. So I'm going back now, say to the late 60s, when drink and drive regulations were brought in for the first time. And say prior to that, people, could drive, even regardless of the amount of alcohol they'd consumed. And so you reinforce the way the problem was tackled was like using standard monetary incentives, saying, well, if you're caught drinking and driving, you'll face a massive fine and be disqualified. So that gets a standard monetary incentive. But there were also lots of campaigns to try to influence how people thought about it. And at the same time, I can't but again, the campaign to wear seatbelts. Now, I'm sure everybody listening, without thinking, getting in the car will just put seatbelts on. But this was the case. At one point, I can't say it's got back a long time, maybe when I was young, I can't know when it came in. But you didn't have to wear a seatbelt. And again, so there are some penalties on drivers, but it was more a sort of nudging behaviour through advertising campaigns, which I think have been very, very successful. And we can interpret these through the lens of behavioural economics and nudge and say, yes, it's not just monetary incentive, something which economists perhaps need to be reminded about, that incentives are possibly non-monetary or try to influence behaviour. And people are trying to do it all the time on different aspects of health, with varying degrees of success. Well, smoking's been good, it's not just been the price, but there's also been sustained campaigns about the impacts, and that's fallen away massively. So I think there are some examples of, I think we should really think about behavioural economics. It's really talking about non-monetary aspects of incentives. If I had to sort of really condense it, something that economists, really, it always essentially been there in the textbooks years and years ago, but people forgot about it and just think it's just monetary incentives which matter. Non-monetary ones can be effective as well. I think there's some examples, but it's obviously hard to replicate, like the obesity at the moment. is a particular challenge. So nobody certainly, not really, hasn't at all cracked the problem of how we actually managed to solve that particular problem. But I feel it would have to be in some way a combination of, monetary and non-monetary incentives. But so that's something we need to be addressing now. But so there's some examples where it's been, really quite successful.
Okay, great. Yes. And you mentioned kind of deviations around architecture of choice and how economic theory might not necessarily be best placed to explain what's
Yeah.
going on within that. Um, what other disciplines? Obviously, psychology has had a great impact in behavioral economics. Are there any other disciplines that you feel can have an impact moving forward?
Well, that's a very important point that you've raised, because this is something that Toller discusses at some length in his book, and it's very interesting. I mean, Kahneman was a psychologist, but by background. But he says, well, have we relied in constructive behavior? Have we relied on psychology? His answer, I mean, it's not quite as simple as this, but he basically says, well, not really. We've not relied on psychology as a discipline. We've just taken the bits from it, which seem useful to us. Because there is, I mean, psychologists don't believe in the rational choice model at all. So he said we can take some bits of evidence there, and if you like, cherry pick what we find useful. And I think the discipline of psychology, the empirical discipline of psychology, is undergoing, really quite substantial problems, because typically what they will do, they'll conduct a survey, an experiment or a survey, and then publish the results. And these can be, designed in a quite sophisticated way. I'm not saying that they're done in a simple or naive way. But this is now a few years ago. There was one of the two leading scientific journals in the world called Science. It published an article with 270 authors, right? Because what they've done, what a leading psychologist had done, he gathered, he looked at 100 very well cited, very prestigious articles in top psychology journals, which reported results of experiments. And he assembled the original teams. That was why there's 270 authors, and said, well, can we replicate these results? And the results were really quite frightening, because in 2/3 of the cases, they couldn't find the same effect at all. And in half the remaining third, they found the same qualitative effect, but it was much weaker. And so he concluded by saying, well, look, and where does this leave us? We don't know whether the original paper was correct, whether the attempted replication was correct, or maybe neither of them were correct. We don't know. So there has been a serious empirical crisis of replication in psychology. So, I mean, Toller was correct. So he takes from it not just individual papers, but concepts where, again, emphasizing this point I was trying to make, where there seems to be a lot of evidence to support something. No matter how prestigious the authors, a single paper or even a couple, no, we've got to have lots of examples before and he's cherry picking that, if you like. So he's choosing from psychology what he finds useful.
Great, thanks. Cool. I'll go to some of the questions that we've got from the audience here then. And the first one here is, to what extent is the subject biased by running experiments on people who are from Western educated, industrial, rich and developed societies?
Well, look, I mean, culture makes a difference, but economics, it does purport to be a general theory of human behavior. So we're saying that agents react to incentives. I'm saying behavioral economics, that reminds us it may be non-monetary just as monetary. And I think we can indeed, we can see this throughout the whole of human history. It's not putting it in the present day, but people do react to incentives. If incentives change, then people's behaviour changes. We can see that throughout human history. It's a very, very well established proposition. That's for rational choice theory. So I'd say it's not in that insight. It might be modified, probably. You know, might modify it. You might have laws against, say, charging excessive rates of interest or whatever. But certainly that's something that, say, medieval Christianity had. They didn't like the concept, what they called usury, of people, charging too much interest, and that was frowned upon. But again, you could think long and short-term profit, short-term profit maximization. So I would say I don't think it's biased in that sense, because we can see so much evidence across a vast range of historical, not just current, but historical societies, insights that incentives matter are very well established. So I don't think, I wouldn't say it was particularly Western oriented or Western biased, even though obviously that's where the university departments are much better funded, and so that's where at the moment most of the research goes on. But it's a universal phenomenon in my view.
Okay, thanks. And a second question here from the audience. Does rational choice happen in all industries, would you say? And how is firm size something that affects it in terms of Sorry.
What's the
So does rational choice happen in all industries? And how is firm size something that affects it? And that's in terms of psychologically, as there could be less to lose.
Oh no, I guess that's many ramifications around that question as well. You'd think that, well, at one level, I would look at it more. All firms may have obviously different motivations. They have to make a profit to survive, so that's fundamental. And this goes back to the question of what constitutes profit maximization. I suppose if you're working for, let's say, Goldman Sachs or in the city, then higher profits means a lot more money for you personally. So you'd be very driven by short-run decisions which increase profits this year in terms of your bonus. So you'd be driven by like short-term profit maximization. If you're a small business that's been around for a number of years and you're very content, it's more like a lifestyle business. You make a decent living, but you no plans to expand. Then your profit decision is we're just going to make enough money to survive. So we're making profits, but in each case we're sort of qualifying the concept of what constitutes profit maximization. But I think now, do we call that behavioural economics, or can we say, well, really, that's always been part of, if you like, the mainstream choice? It just means that we just sort of say, well, what's rational for different people? They have to make a profit, but whether they're doing it to boost short-run profits at all costs or trying to make sure it spreads over time, that's a legitimate choice, and it's not unique. Profit maximization is not uniquely defined. So I think we can rationalize. There's no doubt. I mean, in different firms at different firm sizes, different industries, there are different motivations. But I think we can rationalize the differences in terms of different attitudes to what constitutes profit maximization, rather than necessarily having to involve something called behavioural economics to do that. So that would be my view on that. It's explicable. That was the point I was trying to make on the sort of short and long term, profit maximisation point. It's actually quite a rich question. Different attitudes.
Okay, right. For the audience, if you do have any more questions, do feel free to send them in. I'll just go for this one here. I remember at the start you mentioned that behavioral economics isn't a fundamental critique
Yeah.
of rational agents. I was just wondering whether there are any kind of big assumptions of traditional economics that you believe do need revisions or challenging at least.
Yeah, I think there is one. I'm glad you asked that question. I think it's really um, quite a fundamental one, and it's becoming more important with the growth of the internet. See, one of the assumptions that I mentioned right at the outset was that people will have fixed tastes and preferences. That's an assumption. We know it's not completely true. It's not that we believe that, because obviously, in a person's lifetime, the tastes and preferences change because you don't have the same preferences at 50 that you do at 5, but we can reason that they're not the reason. But I should have added the important assumption that these are independent of other people. Now, I've got my tastes and preferences, and other people can affect my behaviour indirectly. Their choices can affect the set of prices that I'm facing, for example. As they might, so I might not be able to afford. If lots of other people want something, I might not be able to afford as much as I want. But my preference is still the same. I'd still want to buy more if I could. Now, I think this is the one area which is difficult for mainstream economics in that, say, through the internet, that's clearly not the case. I mean, people's behaviour can be influenced directly by what other people do. So let me just give a simple example. When you do, say, simple Google search. Now, we don't know the Google algorithm for the precise order in which the pages come up. But essentially, the more popular a page has already been, the more likely it is to be when you search on that first page of your search. So your behaviour, if you like the information when I search for something, the information that I'll look for, because most people don't get past the first page and click through, that's been influenced by people I'll never know, I don't know who they are, the decisions that they've made in the past. Now, there are models in economics. In economics, it's not that economists are unaware of this. There are models, especially thinking about fashion markets, fads, fashion, again, which seems to be universal throughout human history, fashion objects, where people want something simply because other people do, rather than looking at the objective attributes. They've been around for a long time. But in a sense, until relatively recent, we've been able to box those off and say, okay, here are fashion markets. So we do need a different approach there, but we can contain it in the rational framework. But that part of the world, I think, is increasingly expanding. And we need to think much more about models which allow tastes and preferences to evolve, and also evolve in a way which when they're directly influenced by other people. And the internet, I think, does pose substantial challenges to that. Things before TikTok, things on there become popular because they are popular. And that's something which, say, economists have thought, yeah, we have these models, but we think it's like this big, but in fact, it's probably like this big now, and it's growing all the time. So maybe we need to, think more along those lines.
Okay, great. Amazing. Thank you very much, Paul. Well, as we are approaching 5 o'clock, I think it's probably time to leave things there. But Paul, thank you very much for joining us today
No,
and
problem,
for
sir.
delivering that webinar. I've
Yeah.
certainly learned a lot, to be honest with you. So much appreciated. And thank you to everybody who has joined as well. But Paul, thanks very much. And have a
Okay.
good evening, everybody.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much. Yeah.